Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. On this week's episode, we chew over a few finer details about how hadrosaurs and Triceratops ate.
Hello and welcome to episode... This is the last episode before the questions episode, Dave. It's question... How did we get to episode 7 so quickly?
I was going more to say, how did we get to episode 7?
How? You know people. We've asked them. So we're going to be talking, because we started this series with wonderful rah-rah, chompy, chompy, chomp, chomps. And we're going to end it with stompy, stompy, chomp, chomps. Isn't that right?
No, none of that is right. It is right in a literal interpretation of what you mean, but it's not right. I know you are, because you and the more annoyed I get, the more you do it. I know, but I can't stop myself.
This is Dr. Dave Hone's professional paleontological podcast, ruined by an idiot who likes to say chompy chomp.
Yes, that is very true.
So, over to us earlier, talking to the wonderful Ali. So, welcome to the podcast, Ali Nabavizadeh. Now, this is one of those weird things where you are an expert in basically feeding, dinosaur feeding and jaw anatomy and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Dave knows you only, I think, off Twitter and the fact that you follow and read each other's blogs and are like, friends, weirdly, on the internet. But this is the first time you guys have met. I've only just pressed follow on your Twitter.
Thank you.
So, this is brand new to me. So can you sort of give us a little introduction about where you are in the world, what you research and that sort of thing?
Sure thing. My name is Ali Nabavizadeh. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. So I teach gross anatomy of things like dogs, cats, horses, cows, goats, that kind of stuff. I used to teach human anatomy in medical schools and transitioned here a few years ago. And my research kind of involves looking at the feeding systems of large herbivorous dinosaurs, specifically the ornithischian dinosaurs, things like Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Ankylosaurus, the duck-billed hadrosaurs. And yeah, I'm interested in both kind of bony morphology and how kind of bones and joints would interact with each other, and the diversity you see across the species, across the taxa, but also looking at the morphology of just reconstructing cranial musculature. So the muscles that move the jaws.
Ooh.
We don't have a lot of information, obviously, from soft tissue. All we have really is bones when it comes to the feeding system. So a lot of work has to be done in reconstructing jaw muscles based on little bumps and grooves on the bones that may indicate where muscles would have attached. And in doing so, we can kind of infer potentially the different kinds of muscles that would have attached based on what we know of things like living crocodiles and birds, which are close relatives of dinosaurs, but also other animals as well, and the kinds of adaptations they have. And we can kind of look and see the similarities and differences between them and start to reconstruct the jaw muscles on these animals to then say, okay, well, we have data in different studies that talk about tooth wear, right? So there are lots of studies on herbivorous dinosaurs looking at the wear patterns on their teeth and which way, with the direction in which they move their jaws, the way the teeth kind of occlude with each other as they move in that direction, stuff like that. So with that information, when we reconstruct muscles onto the jaws, we can start to piece together and model how they would have moved their jaws. So my research kind of delves into the actual anatomy of it and looking at possible ways the jaw muscles might be reconstructed on these animals to then help in modeling studies in the future.
This fits kind of nicely because the first episode we had Manabu Sakamoto, who's doing something not entirely dissimilar.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But
yeah.
on Theropods.
Absolutely.
And so we've... or at least, I think he's looked at some herbivores too, but obviously his particular focus is in the carnivorous theropods.
Sure, he does great work.
But this is like the opposite side of things. So we've kind of started at one end and come all the way back, finishing on ornithischians. But certainly, I wanted to try and dive into at least a couple of little things. Mm-hmm. That this is something I think happens to academics. At least I hope it happens to other academics. And now I'm going to look like a complete moron if this doesn't ring a bell with any of my colleagues. But you read stuff early in your career and then that kind of sinks into your head. And then you don't look at that subject really properly again. And so you're stuck with an idea which might have been brand new and wrong or controversial and wrong or other things.
Happens to me a lot.
Right, so I'm immediately thinking back to reading stuff on hadrosaur feeding, so the inverted commas duck-billed dinosaurs, and the idea that when they bite, the lower jaws come up to the upper jaws, and then they kind of slightly shear like outwards and like push out past each other. And I have no idea if anyone still thinks that's actually what they did.
I'm now trying to do that with my face at the moment, by the way, in case you're wondering why I'm crying.
So the teeth do meet at an angle. So the upper and so that our teeth are more or less flat. So they're meeting top to bottom and just touch each other. And if you basically put their teeth at 45 degrees, that would still work. You could still bite and those two things would meet at 45 degrees. But in theory, at least, it would be much better if once they met, they slid past each other and then you had a grinding surface.
Right.
And if I remembering correctly, this guy got proposed in the late 90s. I read it in the early 2000s, and that's the last I've heard of it. And it's been in my head this entire time. And we've now, 15, 18 years later, I'm like, that might be complete nonsense. And now I've got someone I can ask.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's really interesting. Hadrosaur, duck-billed dinosaur feeding is one of the most complex problems that I've ever had to work with. And I'm still to this day, it boggles my mind. So little history on that. In the 80s, David Weishampel, as well as David Norman, two very prominent paleontologists, one from England, one from America, they both simultaneously kind of came up with this idea that hadrosaurs and their relatives, like iguanodon, their upper jaw moved outward so that those teeth that, like you said, are angled in occlusion would slide past each other and grind the plant material. And they said this based on, morphology of the joints within the skull. And it's not unheard of. There's a lot of animals that have what's called cranial kinesis, which is basically movement between bones within the skull itself, not in the lower jaw, but in the actual head.
Yeah, the famous one that people might have heard of is parrots and parakeets.
Yeah, parrots.
If you
parrots
watch videos of them, the lower jaw moves, but so does the top one independently.
Exactly.
I was thinking of oyster catchers as well, because I think their actual beak bends in places.
Yeah.
Weirdly.
A lot of birds have different kinds of movement of the skull bones. There are different categories and stuff like this. Crazy. So it's a big feature in birds, it's a big feature in lizards. And so it was also hypothesized in hadrosaurs. And they termed it pleurokinesis. So another type of movement of this. It's kind of like a different kind of movement of the skull bones, let's say. And it was kind of the well-accepted hypothesis for a couple decades, right? There's a lot of merit to it, and you can see the joints in the skull, and you can see that there might have been mobility. They're articulated and things like that. So it's not impossible. But then some researchers started to kind of look into it more, and there have been modeling studies that kind of suggested, well, maybe this kind of movement within the bones would not be possible because it would kind of interfere with different muscles that are within the skull, or different joints would have to open up too wide, or things like that. Kind of really looking into it and modeling specific bony articulations throughout the skull. There's a lot of little nuances that cause problems, let's say, in this kind of hypothesis. And so some kind of alternate hypotheses have been kind of put out there, but not really looked at very much, to say, well, okay, maybe instead of the upper jaw, maybe there's a bit of mobility in the lower jaw instead. And hadrosaurs and ornithischians as a whole are one thing that makes them unique is that they have something called a predentary bone. It's this little tiny bone in the front of their chin. It's a separate one. So like for us, we have one bone that goes all the way across from one side to the other, right? That's our mandible. But in these dinosaurs, they actually, toward the front of their jaw, they have three separate bones, the two side and then one in the front. This is not counting a bunch of bones in the back of the jaw, but in the front chin part of it, they have two on the side and one right in the middle. And this middle bone, the predentary bone, is unique to ornithischians. And a potential, and this is something that I kind of was really interested in as an undergrad. So I was at the University of Kansas when I was an undergraduate, and I was interested in this predentary bone and what its function was. Like, why do they have it? It's so weird. It's not something you see very often. And in looking and specifically at hadrosaurs, the duckbills, I noticed that the predentary, when you actually articulate it with the front of the lower jaws in the hadrosaur, it doesn't actually clasp on tight. It's this really loose connection. There's no clear clasping junction between them. I mean, as an undergrad, do it. I kind of noticed that in museums, like just, in the display cases in museums and things like that, or just the mounts, I noticed that the predenter is just kind of floating there. And I was like, well, why isn't it actually like clasping on? So then to me, that was like, well, that meant, well, maybe there's some mobility there. Maybe there's a fibrocartilaginous ligament, so fibrocartilaginous, so cartilage, but also like fibrous material within it. Cartilage is a little more bendy than bone, so it's kind of creates this connection between the bone, but allows them to move against each other. So it basically allows the two sides of the jaws to rotate along their long axis. So kind of like a boat rocking side to side like this.
Well, boats don't do that because they'd snap. So how on earth? You can't have a boat that bends at the keel. That's weird.
Each side is a boat. Each side of the boat.
Each side is a boat. Okay, two boats.
So imagine you have two boats going like this,
chained together at the front,
rocking back and forth. That's what I was trying to say. Sorry.
But that's crazy.
So so we'd say rotating along the long axis. So both sides of the jaw would rotate at the same time while the predentary was still stable in the front. It basically would have allowed the two sides of the jaw to independently rotate while still being stabilized at the front of the jaw. So for most animals that chew, specifically mammals like us and a lot of mammalian herbivores, when you chew your food, do you chew on one side of the jaw or both sides of the jaw? Do you chew on one side or both?
I chew on one side.
You chew on one side, yeah.
And I find it weird if I chew on the other side.
Exactly. You very rarely actually chew with both sides of the jaw coming up and down, unless you're like biting into a steak or something like that, So for me, I kind of thought, okay, well, a lot of animals have to focus all the muscle force on that one bite point on one side of the jaw, which means muscle forces from the muscle on the other side of your skull have to go through the chin to then focus on the bite point on the other side that you're actually chewing on. So all that muscle force, because you have jaw muscles on both sides of your head, right? So when you're actually chewing, those muscles are still contracting. But because you're not biting down on this side, those muscle forces start to transmit all the way toward the front of the chin, bypass it, go to the other side of the jaw, and specifically focus on that one bite point. And I thought, okay, well, that's a lot of animals that chew their food. This is how they chew their food, mammals specifically. But what if ornithischians, because they have that predentary bone, were able to focus their jaw muscles on each side of the jaw and actually chew on both sides at the same time while keeping the mandible stable? This is not something that mammals can do, but because they have that separate bone in the front, it would have allowed them to rotate the jaw and actually have the teeth come into occlusion and rotate and slide past each other while still having the jaw stabilized like that. And so this would double their intake, right? Because they're chewing twice as much and able to process it and these guys are eating all day.
That seems like a mad bit of mechanics to me. Obviously, I realised I chew on one side. Every time I've got gum, I know which side I chew on. It's normal that, you chew on one and you're like, you're right, it's a complete waste of the other side. Why don't we have half a mouth?
Exactly.
Or just one set of like big teeth in the middle. So what I've done in my head, I haven't done it in my head. I've actually got my fingers crossed and I've sort of put them side by side and I'm sort of massaging my fingers whilst rotating them. And so each one is grinding. If they're slip sliding, are they slip sliding horizontally at that point, each side of the jaw, or are they going back and forth vertically? It's horizontally.
Hadrosaurs actually do both.
Oh my gosh.
They both go kind of rotate along this, but they also pull their jaw backward. We see this in their tooth wear. And so that side to side movement of the jaw that we see in the tooth wear was always a head scratcher, which is what kind of led both Weisample and Norman to suggest that their upper jaw was moving outward. Now, Dave Weisample was my PhD mentor. So I came out of undergrad going into grad school with him, and we talked a lot about this because it was his hypothesis from the 80s. And so mine basically had the same result, but using the opposite bone, basically. And honestly, they both could work hand in hand. It could be, but both the upper jaw and the lower jaw were rotating. Yeah, that would be a lot more complex, but it could help with, very specific crushing mechanisms mechanisms that could have occurred. But yeah, it's basically just an alternative hypothesis that ends with the same result.
It does sort of occur to me that that's a really complex structure. I know cows have got very elaborate sort of, systems of stomachs and everything else, but we just think, they're just mashing stuff. All they need to do is mash. Why would they need such complex structure to be able to... Is it just about volume, or are they eating very specific things that require a lot of dexterity?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it has to do with the type of plant material they're eating. Typically, animals that are eating softer vegetation or fruits and things like that don't need as complex of a feeding mechanism as, say, something that's eating tough woody material or something with tough leaves or things like that. Or whether something is a browser or a grazer. So browsing would be like eating tree bark versus grazing, eating grass. Now, there wasn't really a lot of grass at all during the time of the dinosaurs, except maybe at the very end of the time of the dinosaurs. But they were eating different types of conifers, or even flowering plants like angiosperms toward the end of the Cretaceous. And so all of these different kinds of plants started to require more diverse feeding mechanisms so that A, they can actually process the material, and B, they can keep up with the competition of the species around them, or like they can have their own niche, so to speak, and kind of stick with that in their own environment, and just kind of adapt as these animals evolve through time. So yeah, a lot of it has to do with volume, as you said, and a lot of it has to do with just the structure of the plant material and how tough or soft it is, or just what's available. And another thing that's important is feeding height. So how tall an animal is determines how far up they can eat. And different kinds of plants are at different levels of height. So like you have shrubs and little cycads and things like that at the very bottom. So like low-level eaters like Stegosaurus would have eaten those. Whereas higher up, you have like between them and hadrosaurs would be ceratopsians, a little bit taller. And then taller than that is hadrosaurs, eating things off of taller trees, so twigs and bark and things like that. So all of these things are determining factors in their feeding mechanisms as well.
And I'd add to that, of course, that don't forget that things grow.
Exactly.
So, I've talked to Jordan Mallon, a good friend of mine, who's done quite a lot of feeding height, and it's not that he obviously doesn't factor it in, but we tend to focus on adults for everything. Yeah. And it's like, a big hadrosaur like Edmontosaurus or Shantagosaurus can reach this high, fine, but a half-size one can't.
Absolutely.
And a quarter-size one, let alone something that's maybe a year or two old and is still kind of like sheep-sized, is not feeding 3-4 meters off the ground, because short of giving them a forklift, they are unlikely to be able to reach those kind of heights.
Yeah, and it's so crazy to me how little has been done on feeding in juvenile dinosaurs. There's hardly anything. Yeah, we haven't gotten any. It's true, but yeah, it's very, very rare to find any kind of study. And I think we're starting to pop up, which is great, because we really need that kind of information to really understand these animals. But yeah, all we've really been working with is adults or sub-adults or whatever.
So when I look at a ceratopsian, so I spent a fair bit of time in Dinosaur Park in Canada, and you find lots of teeth and you find lots of bits of jaws.
Right.
And yeah, with the hadrosaurs, you have this real, this famous like tooth battery where you have your top row of teeth which have been worn away or are being worn away by this process.
Yes.
And you can see like row upon row, like 7 or 8 rows of teeth underneath that are growing up and are going to be next in line. It's a giant conveyor belt.
Yeah.
And ceratopsians aren't a million miles away from that.
No.
And certainly if you just look at the kind of top row and that wear, it's pretty similar. But I look at a Triceratops jaw and go, that's really not that different. And therefore, actually, are we not exactly overselling the hadrosaurs? But I think the fact that we keep going the hadrosaur tooth battery, even when iguanodonts already have basically the same thing, kind of implies that it's just like this ornithopod, iguanodonts and hadrosaurs do this and the others don't. And I don't think that's fair.
No, it's not.
When the ceratopsians look not as extreme, but like 80% of the way there, to pull a vague random number out.
That's right. Yeah. No, ceratopsians they're my favorite group. The horned dinosaurs are their anatomy is just kind of beyond crazy to me. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They also have a tooth battery. It's not quite as tooth heavy as hadrosaurs, but they're still in their own right there are lots of columns of teeth in a ceratopsian jaw as well. There's a lot of variation in their occlusion, just as there are with within hadrosaurs. So they're doing very similar things as far as their teeth are concerned.
Now, they're definitely not moving their top bits of the head, though. I mean,
no, absolutely not.
Well, right, but but the top half is just rigid. It's a lump.
Exactly. And not only that, their bottom jaws are rigid too.
Right, so that's where I'm going. When you've just been saying about the hadrosaur flexibility, so in the ceratopsians, you've got the same kind of tooth arrangement, but not the same jaw arrangement.
Right. It's important to consider, though, that their tooth occlusion is very different.
What does occlusion mean? So
occlusion is when two teeth meet. The point where the upper tooth and the lower tooth meet. That is a point of occlusion. So anytime, someone says like teeth are occluding or tooth occlusion, it's the act of having two teeth meet each other and either grind past each other. Exactly. This tooth occlusion in ceratopsians, a lot of cases, especially the big ceratopsids, the one with lots of horns and frill features of all shapes and sizes, their occlusion is a lot more vertical. So the teeth actually slide more vertically at less of an angle than, say, a hadrosaur does. Ceratopsid teeth are a lot more like this. So this kind of occlusion, it would allow at least one side of the jaw to move up into occlusion like this. But it still allows them to both go up and down as well as slide backward. Ceratopsids don't have that kind of side-to-side motion that you see in hadrosaurs. They have either the straight up and down or front to back.
Do they have both? Are there any that look like they have both?
Yep, they have both. Correct. Yeah, they have both up and down as well as front to back. So with that, their predentary, I call it a second, I kind of refer to it as like a secondary fusion of the chin. So the two sides of the jaw and the predentary fuse together in these later ceratopsid dinosaurs. Whereas in the much earlier, much smaller animals, it's still a loose connection. So they specifically went toward making it more like our jaws rather than having a more mobile jaw.
Well, in many ways, it sounds more like a predator's jaw, like a cat or a dog, because they've got very slicey teeth and they sort of meet that. They sort of slide past each other to cut stuff.
Yeah, in some ways it is, yeah. Which is an interesting thing to think about. I mean, we could tell from the tooth where they're definitely eating plants, but the way that they use their jaws is kind of because of the size of their head or the length of their jaws or just the kind of plants they're eating again. They kind of went toward this kind of mechanism in which they fuse the jaw together. And a lot of herbivorous mammals today have fused jaws too. Like elephants, for instance, have all fusion all the way across. So it's not unheard of for herbivores to fuse their jaw. A lot of them do that as well. But at the same time, the way they move their jaws and the mechanism that you see in them is an adaptation for really hardcore herbivory. Like they're chomping on tough woody plant material.
So that really fits with the beak because you look at the beak of a ceratopsian and it's slight exaggeration, so it looks like an eagle or a parrot, but it's this big curved spiked thing at the front. And you compare that to the hadrosaurs and they've got this horrible misnomer of duckbills, but at the same time we use it because everyone's heard of duckbills.
Right.
Because there's the idea that their jaw kind of, at least, and some of them at least do, they've got a kind of fairly horsey head, but then near the front, it kind of flattens out and spreads out a bit. And it's a bit duck-like, but that's the bone.
And
then,
exactly.
Of course, at least a few of them have the beak, the keratinous beak preserved, and it hangs vertically. It doesn't spray out forwards. It hangs vertically, and it's serrated along the margin.
Mm-hmm.
So, if anyone's seen a duck with a beak that points straight up and down with serrations along it.
Yeah.
Tell me about that duck, because that is a duck I want to see. But it gives people, I think, this very, that classic, they're hanging around in water and eating soft plants. It's like, no, they've got this dirty, great, fanged, serrated saw beak.
And that was what was thought decades ago, right? There were hadrosaurs just wading through water, eating seaweed or something like that. And that's what you see in really old illustrations and paintings and things like that.
Fantasia, classically.
Fantasia, exactly. Yeah. Fantasia, classic 40s. It's just like showing him chewing side to side, just like with a dopey look on its face. But it definitely not ducks.
So like bird beaks, dinosaur beaks. Are they very similar? They made out the same stuff? Because are they bone covered in stuff, or are they just straight bone? What is a beak made of?
They're bone covered in keratin. So
okay,
the
like
actual
a nail,
beak part
keratin.
of it, yeah, like a nail, exactly. Like your nail or hair, the stuff, kind of the dead skin tissues that become really hardened. That is what creates the beak in a bird, or the beak in any kind of dinosaurs that have beaks, or a beak of a turtle, things like that.
So does that mean they need to trim this sort of like serrated edge on stuff like cats do sharpening their claws and stuff? Or do birds... I literally don't know if birds sharpen their beaks.
Eagles and stuff do. Yeah, you can see film of them. They'll if they're on a branch, they'll, just like you sharpen a knife, they'll rub their head side to side in a stereotype way along the edge and sharpen it up.
So if they didn't do that, would they get a big bulgy blunt beak eventually? 'Cause would the keratin keep growing like nails?
I can imagine they would, in the way that guinea pigs and rabbits and things with constantly growing teeth, if they're not eating the kind of stuff they're supposed to be, evolution will have selected... If you're eating something really tough and wearing that away, evolution will select for the animals that grow it fast. And then if you're one of the animals that now isn't wearing it away, it's gonna go wrong.
Oh yeah, I had so when I was younger, my parents had a cage of finches, and at one point I remember there was one finch that for some reason its lower beak grew out too long and got it stuck in the side of its feather, and so it just got stuck in the side of its shoulder. And my dad pulled it out and just gently pulled out the beak, and you could see the lower beak was longer than the upper beak because it grew out too much, I guess. But yeah, so I assume a lot of problems happen like that they would definitely need to shave it down.
Makes you thankful you don't have a beak.
The next question that has been stuck in my mind, which will be the most painful one for Ali to answer, but also the one that I know everyone's going to want to know the answer to, is, do they have cheeks?
Yes, the most important question of all for anyone.
It matters.
I mean, obviously, and yet at the same time. So my most recent book, just to plug that briefly, I did like a couple of pages on lips, because obviously lips in dinosaurs in general, and theropods in particular is like a thing right now. And when I sent the draft of the book in, the publishers came back with, what the hell is that 2 pages? Take it all out. And I'm like, oh no, you have no idea how big a deal lips in theropods is right now. So it's staying in. And in the same vein, it's like, I'm kind of sick of talking about lips in theropods, and yet you kind of have to. But it's the same thing in that, cheeks in ornithischians in particular, and the hadrosaurs and the big chewers, is a big deal in that loads of people keep talking about it, and it keeps coming back again and again. And here we've got someone reconstructing the jaw musculature of chewing ornithischians. So take it away.
Sure. This question has been the bane of my existence since, I don't know, a decade at least, if not more.
Hooray!
So this is actually one of the reasons I started to look more into like a new reconstruction of jaw muscles in these animals, was that none of the jaw muscle reconstructions we had actually made sense for the movements of the jaws that they were making. In my view, looking at the mechanics of it, having something that pulls back the jaw needs jaw muscles that actually support it in order to do so, and give that mechanical advantage to do so. Now, people may disagree with me. The biggest problem for me was that we were reconstructing jaw muscles in herbivorous dinosaurs the exact same way we reconstruct it in carnivorous dinosaurs. And they looked exactly the same. Why? Because we're looking at birds and crocodiles to reconstruct it. And because of this arrangement that was used literally across all of dinosaurs, I had to do, these kind of, basic 2D lever arm mechanics studies based on those reconstructions. And, to an extent they help, obviously, but there's just a lot that just didn't sit well with me, because I was like, why is it the same as a carnivore when their jaws are doing completely different things? So I started to look into it more. And this is at the same time you see a lot of things about cheeks in ornithischian dinosaurs. And it was a hypothesis that's gone on for over a century. And Galton in 1973 wrote a paper about it, kind of reinforcing the fact that maybe they did have a separate new muscle that bridged between the upper jaw and the lower jaw. And it's this vertical muscle that they they likened it to what you see in a lot of mammals, which is called a buccinator muscle. So our cheek muscle in here,
let's all just feel our face,
is kind of bridges up and down, but it's more complex than that. But yeah, there's a muscle in here.
You're basically hamster cheek bit under.
Yeah, exactly.
Under your
Yeah,
eyes.
the hamster cheek bit. Exactly. Yep. There's a muscle in there. So it was said that, well, they had a novel muscle that they developed that helped keep food in the mouth, and that was really the only justification, was that they need to keep food in the mouth and they need something there to hold it in, and that there are ridges on the jaws that show that there is a muscle there or something.
I would say, so as someone who doesn't look at that stuff in detail but does know his way around antelope and other stuff like that, that intuitively sounds like it does make a lot of sense. If you've got these giant 10 plus ton animals who we think are eating not all day every day but certainly massive intake of food, and as part of that they're going to have to chew to break it up, the idea that half of that falls out of the head every time they take a bite is so hilariously and massively inefficient that they've simply got to keep food in the mouth. A herbivore that drops half of what it eats is no herbivore, and doubly so when it's a giant animal. So I would not necessarily defend that, and I would say I have an enormous sympathy for the public, because I'm one of them at this level going, well, of course it's got something on the side of its head. You gotta eat, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But equally though, Dave, do they have, like, when I get stuff in my cheeks, I have this very useful thing called a big thick tongue, which I can use to sort of pick stuff out my teeth and actually swallow it. And from what I'm hearing, I don't know if they had these large tongues that be able to do that.
Big tongue, yes, but not agile, not mobile.
Yeah. So, cheeks would just be annoying, because all you're doing is getting matter stuck there forever.
Yeah, and these are all, absolutely, everything that you're mentioning are all problems that need to be solved, right? So here's my take on this. Mammals have something called muscles of facial expression. They're separate from the muscles that chew food, okay? There are muscles that chew food like temporalis. So if you put your hands on the side of your hand and clench your jaw,
they bulge.
You feel that bulging? That's a temporalis muscle. That's a muscle that helps elevate your jaw into occlusion, to have your teeth come together. Simultaneously, you put your hands on the side of your lower jaw like this, clench your teeth, the bulge there, that's your masseter muscle. That is very important for actual rotation and chewing of the food. Okay, so there's a big muscle to move the jaw up, there's a big muscle to rotate the jaw. Now, dinosaurs have very different jaw muscles, but they do the same kind of motions, and they're still muscles of mastication. That's what they're called. Muscles that help you chew your food. All vertebrates have this, no problem. Mammals have something unique called muscles of facial expression, and these are the muscles that help us elevate and lower our eyebrows, smile, frown, move our nose, crinkle your nose, move your cheeks. All of these muscles that actually move your face, this is a very mammalian feature. And developmentally, I go into more detail with this in my anatomy course for the vet students. Evolutionarily, the reason mammals have this is because, there are many reasons that they could have, but one outstanding reason could be that mammals need to suckle. And in order to suckle, you need to purse your lips to do so. And things like reptiles and birds and things like that don't need to do that. So they don't need these muscles. But mammals developed them and evolved them. And over time, they started to differentiate and do lots of crazy things. And you have things like elephants that use their nose and upper lip to actually pick things up and move around and grab branches and things like that. So it's a very, very uniquely mammalian feature. And so dinosaurs obviously are not mammals. They are related to, they are reptiles that evolved from things that look like crocodiles and evolved into birds. And so these animals do not have muscles of facial expression. So in order for them to create that jaw, they need to either evolve muscles of facial expression themselves, which is from a completely different muscle set, or they need to create it from the jaw muscles and have it extend forward. Now, this is not impossible, and it could have happened, right? But when we do that, we're getting into a lot of wishy-washy, like it could have done this, and if so, it probably looked like this or like this. And there have been a few interpretations of how a new cheek muscle might have been formed, right? But we don't have any, it's not within what we call the extant phylogenetic bracket, which means bracketing or kind of looking at two closely related animals, and if dinosaurs are between them, like say crocodiles and birds, using them as a way to say, okay, well, these animals have these kinds of muscles or features, and therefore dinosaurs either had them, or if they had new ones, we would have to see structures in the bone to do that. So it all comes down to interpretation, right? If we want to interpret this ridge on the bottom of the jaw or top of the jaw to create a separate muscle. So that's all fine. And this is what was done, is that they said, okay, well, this novel muscle formed. And it caused a lot of issue with a lot of people that are, say, really want to stay within the bounds of the extant phylogenetic bracket. They say, well, we don't have any evidence of this because nothing related to them has this kind of feature, which maybe they did have this new muscle, maybe not. I'm very much I'm not as much into the extant phylogenetic bracket. I don't have to stay within those bounds in my interpretations, but I kind of look to see what if there is an alternative explanation that could be potentially more within the bounds of the extant phylogenetic bracket. Is there a way that we can solve this problem to both hold food in the mouth, but also not have to create a new muscle? And so I started to look at the muscle, the kind of the structure of the jaws. And there's this little kind of part of the jaw, toward the back of the jaw, that extends upward, a bit of bone called the coronoid process. This bone is where a lot of those jaw muscles attach, right? And the taller it is, the more mechanical advantage it creates for the jaw. It gives it more, it makes it more mechanically sound.
I did want to mention that because, that's something that's worth kind of talking about. And again, it actually goes back to our first episode. We talked about Manabu. So he was talking about theropods and the fact that, their jaws really are simple levers, that, or simple hinges. They just go up and down. And yours don't do that. And that's part of the complication. But yeah, anyone who's seen a photo of a hadrosaur jaw in particular, but it's true of most ornithischians, in side view, and we do often get the jaws come apart, and so you've just got it in side view. It's a big L shape on its side. It's the big long bit of the bottom of the jaw, and then the coronoid process just sticks up at the top, and it goes right up towards the top of the skull in some things. And like when you put the lower jaw in, you've got the little hinge at the back, and then this L just goes up, almost as high as the eyeball.
Absolutely.
And people really, really don't expect that. And I just want to flag that up as being, you're not just talking about a little extension here, you're talking about a big, big thing, which completely changes the shape of their jaws compared to what people would be used to for theropods or sauropods.
Exactly.
And he's, massively linked and influential on all these jaw articulations and, musculature and how these jaws move. So just want to emphasize that point.
Absolutely. Now, a thing important to note here is that coronoid process, yes, of course, it's an attachment for those jaw muscles, but it's specifically an attachment for jaw muscles that elevate the jaw. And this is key to understand, because even I did it, in my study in 2016, I looked at a muscle that attached to the very top of that jaw. And I looked at the mechanical advantage of different species all throughout ornithischians to see what kind of differences you see. But at the end of the day, that is for muscles that mainly elevate the jaw. Now, in some cases, they could pull the jaw back as well. But because it's in the back of the jaw, the amount of leverage it would have for teeth more toward the front of the jaw to actually occlude with enough force is not sufficient. And if you look at mammals today, a lot of herbivorous mammals also have also called a coronoid process. It's not the same exact structure, but it's working the exact same way. Horses have it, cows have it, deer have it, all these things have a coronoid process in a mammalian form. And they're doing the same thing, but they also have a masseter. And the masseter actually is on the outside and extends farther forward on the jaw, on the side of the face, in fact, in order to help with the actual rotational chewing aspect of it. Whereas things like carnivorans, like lions and dogs, they also have a masseter, but it's not as the relative size between the temporalis, which elevates the jaw, and the masseter is not as large. Herbivorous mammals have a lot larger masseter compared to the size of their temporalis because they need to actually chew vegetation, whereas carnivores don't. And so I thought, okay, well, let's look at theropods. Theropods have that basic structure. They have a bit of an elevation of the back of the jaw for a coronoid region, but not much at all. In some cases, not at all, just like kind of flat. just like a lot of carnivore of today, like lions and dogs and things like that. Very similar. And then herbivorous dinosaurs have the coronoid process, much like a lot of herbivorous mammals do. But on top of that, those herbivorous mammals have a masseter that extends farther forward. And this is where the bulk of the actual force in feeding comes in. Not just elevating the jaw, but actually chewing, doing some kind of rotational movement. Now, obviously, herbivorous dinosaurs weren't doing it the same as herbivorous mammals of today. However, they still need to process plant material with enough force to be able to take it in. So when looking at the way that they chew their food, a big component of the much larger ornithischian feeding mechanisms, things like hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, even ankylosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, they have a component in which their jaw pulls back rotationally and pulls back. Mammals don't do this. They chew side to side and up and down, but they don't pull the jaw back. In fact, not really anything living today has that. This motion is called a palinal motion, going from the front to the back while in occlusion. Now, yes, we can pull our jaws back, but we don't pull our jaws back while chewing. You just try to do it yourself. You're like, this is weird, right? So nothing today does that. Another early mammalian relative, which is an herbivore called Dicynodonts, they did that. They pulled their jaw back. And interestingly, these Dicynodonts have a muscle, not from the lower jaw, but from the upper jaw, that extends far forward on the lower jaw. It goes from here all the way toward the front of almost like near the front of the beak. You can see this ridge on the side of the jaw. This ridge looks very similar to the ridge that you see in ceratopsians. It's the same thing. And this is the ridge, this bump or kind of this extension of bone that has been interpreted as an attachment site for this new cheek muscle that would go up and down. So I thought, what if instead of that, the outer layer of the jaw muscles that attach to the coronoid process, what if the outer layer actually extended far forward from the top of the head all the way down to near the front of the beak, or maybe at different levels, depending on what they're doing, right? This would help elevate the jaw as well as pulling it back while in occlusion, this palinal motion. So it both accommodates the orthal, which is up and down, as well as palinal, which is pulling back. And so in ceratopsians, because they have that fusion in the front of the chin, they can do that very, very kind of this like uniform motion like this, and the up going up and then pulling back. And this extension of muscle would go far forward. Now, so that means that this ridge on the side wouldn't be a cheek muscle that goes up and down from the upper jaw to the lower jaw, but in fact from the back of the head extending forward to the front of the jaw. And if you look at the side of the skull of a ceratopsian, the ridge on the upper jaw is actually at an angle that continues on from the opening of those where those muscles would come out. So when the jaw is closed, those muscles that are extending like this would fit inside of that ridge just perfectly. So in essence, when its jaw is closed, it would actually also help in keeping the food within the mouth.
It's gonna cover the mouth, or at least a large part of the opening that you see on the side. It covers
the mouth, with just in a different way. So instead of the muscle, it's just basically instead of a new muscle that goes up and down, they're using a muscle that already exists and just extending it forward. And when I looked at the opening of where the jaw muscle would come out, the attachment sites of where they would be, it all fit. Anything with a coronoid process today has a muscle attached to the outside of it as well. We never reconstructed it that way for dinosaurs for some reason. This is how it was reconstructed by Ostrom in the 60s, which was really the foundation of what all these reconstructions have been based on. But nothing was attached to the outside of the coronoid. And you see this ridge extends from it actually continues on onto the outside of the coronoid process. So it's not just in front of it, it actually goes onto the outside of this process and continues on. So this muscle is actually attaching on the outside of the coronoid process, as well as having fibers that extend forward. And so this would create basically enough leverage for the jaw to come up in occlusion with all the teeth at once, which is what herbivores do, and then also pull the jaw back.
So really grinding away at that upper jaw.
Yeah, really grinding away. And so in ceratopsians specifically, it's like the most extreme case of this, right? Because their jaws actually fit that. In ankylosaurs and hadrosaurs, it's a little bit less so, but you can still see those kinds of morphologies in them. And so this kind of gets into the question of if they had lips or cheeks. Now, maybe they don't have a new muscle, cheek muscle, but it's very possible that they still had skin on the outside that either was in the form of lips, quote unquote. I hate calling them lips because lips in our definition actually have muscles within them, but reptile people call them lips anyways. So,
extraoral tissue is the...
Extraoral tissue, yeah, exactly. Extraoral tissue. So anything that when you close your mouth, it hides your teeth, basically. Which, in the way that these herbivores are eating, the argument that they need cheeks to do it, when they're eating, they close their mouths anyway. So they're not like chewing like this. They're pulling their jaw back while the mouth is closed. So even if they just had lips all the way across, it would still hold food in the mouth. I don't know why people still don't actually say this. Iguanas do that. Iguanas are herbivores and they have lips, right? So it doesn't matter how big you are. It's just a matter of how you can hold your mouth together.
I mean, I think it's at least in part that language problem, which I've banged on about again and again and again.
Exactly.
We think of our lips as just being the very front of the mouth and the cheeks as being the side. And that's kind of true, but we're also kind of weird.
Exactly.
In that we have very specialized articulations and arrangements of our jaws and our muscles and the tissue that sits outside. And most animals kind of don't. And so, I think people are conflating the word cheek, which anatomically we think of as being muscled, with covering the side of the mouth. And those two aren't the same thing.
Absolutely. It's been a little aggravating because when I published this paper, when it came to extraoral tissue, I kind of gave some it had to be hand wavy. It's it could have had extraoral tissue or it could have been a flap of skin. We don't know. There's no way of knowing unless we have a mummy, a dinosaur mummy, which is preserved skin somewhere. And yet, what's funny is that half of the people that talk about my study say, oh, he says there were no cheeks and there's no skin on the side and they just the muscle with mucosa on it. And so they'll say this is scientifically accurate. And the other side is no, it could still have a flap of skin. It's still anatomically accurate. I'm actually with the second group saying it could be either one. Stop using me as your way of trying to justify you giving it lips or cheeks or cheek, quote unquote.
But what I'm understanding as an amateur person is they definitely couldn't whistle.
They're going to struggle.
Yes, they're going to struggle whistling. That's true. They cannot whistle. Absolutely.
The hadrosaurs have got that nice crest at the back, so they're definitely getting some good sound production.
Yeah, they can honk.
This muscle that connects to the back, is that going to give them quite a round face if you're looking at them square on, if it comes at the back and then comes straight forward along the snout?
Yeah,
so it's going to be heavy, overly Botox sort of cheekbones coming all the way to the front and makes them look quite smooth, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Especially when they're actually biting down, that muscle would bulge out a little bit, right? So it would create this more kind of bulky look in the front of their jaw than maybe they're used to.
I'm thinking if you imagine a giant almond, that sort of shape, they might be quite prettier than you imagine sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of sleekness.
Definitely. Yeah. It definitely gives room to give a little more girthiness to the front of the snout and round smoothness, like you said. I like that.
Neat. I think we're more or less done, but there's just one thing I wanted to touch on towards the end, which I thought was worth highlighting, which we definitely mentioned before, but it picks up nicely because of you and Dave Weishampel, is the fact that in the States, a lot of paleontologists, or at least dinosaur paleontologists, are basically embedded in medicine, or that's kind of their career, because I think in the UK and Europe and probably most of the rest of the world, it's a kind of, you're in a university like me teaching biology or geology, or you're at a museum of some description. And yet, Weishampel at Johns Hopkins, you're doing vet stuff, and just off the top of my head, Larry Whitmer, Matt Weddell, Mike Habib, Chris Bennett, there's a big long list of academic paleontologists who work on dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and other big fossil reptiles, and other things too, but obviously that's my community, who are basically embedded teaching medical anatomy to medicals or veterinary students and dentists.
Yes.
And I think that's just worth just kind of talking about a little bit, because I think that would come as a surprise to a lot of people.
I'm just going to guess, it's pushy parents saying, you don't do a degree, you can actually get a job in, and then you can just work out a way of getting out of it.
So I come from an Iranian background. My parents are from Iran. And a lot of people in our culture, their parents will say, be a doctor, go into medicine, that kind of thing. And when I was an undergrad, my dad told me, I don't know, he was just spitballing. He was just being facetious, but he was saying, if you get into Johns Hopkins Medical School, I would buy you a BMW. And I was like, okay. And then as time went on through my undergrad, I didn't want to go into medicine. I wanted to go into functional anatomy. And yet I got into the PhD program in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine.
Nice.
So I went back to my dad. I was like, hey, Dad, so you remember when you said that if I get into Hopkins Medical School, you get me BMW? I was just joking. And my dad apparently went to my mom. Was like, I don't know what to do. I promised him. My mom's like, you're not buying him a BMW.
I was going to say, is that the bit where you get the remote controlled car for Christmas?
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
Here it is. It's a foot long.
Exactly. No, it's actually really great. And I think, there are, as you said, there are many paleontologists in the US who are going towards anatomy teaching positions, anatomy faculty positions in medical institutions or veterinary institutions, things like that, which I thought was pretty wild when I first, heard about it even. And as you go into it, you start to realize, it's actually the benefits of having someone like a paleontologist or comparative anatomist as your anatomy professor are quite large in a medical institution. And the reason being is that there are certain anatomical structures that are so crazy to comprehend that you don't really understand why it's like that unless you understand it's the evolutionary trajectory toward which it got that way. And us paleontologists, we're very good at trying to, pick that out and try to explain anatomy in a way that's not just remember this, memorize that, but putting it in an evolutionary context so that they understand why the anatomy is a certain way, so that if something goes wrong clinically, they can understand where that stems from, right? And so kind of having people that are paleontologists that teach in a medical school actually helps bridge that gap between people in medicine who just know that anatomy exists and things can go wrong, with knowing how the anatomy got that way evolutionarily, so that you can start to understand developmental issues that could occur, or the reason why certain things go wrong in the anatomy, because just based on how weird it is and things like that. So I think more and more medical institutions are starting to see that, because before it's almost unheard of to have a paleontologist teaching anatomy in a medical institution. But I guess over time, people like Dave Weishampel and Ken Rose, who are at Hopkins, and Larry Whitmer at Ohio.
Well, and even the next generation, because you got Eric Snively, who used to be
absolutely
with Larry now, and he's got Danny Barter with him as well
exactly.
now. So it's just spreading and spreading.
I just think it's confused recruiters at medical colleges think, well, we've got an aging population, so paleontology's probably the best way to go.
That's good.
It's not too far. I've always assumed I totally agree with the evolution thing. So a good friend of mine at Queen Mary here used to teach the human anatomy stuff for our biomedical students, and he used to put some evolutionary stuff in there because he was a biologist, and that really helped them. But I've always assumed that, at least in part, the reason in the States is the medics think that teaching anatomy is below them, and they don't want to do it. They want to do all the exciting clinical stuff and don't want to be messing around with cadavers in the first year pre-meds, and so they're quite happy to hand it over. But actually, and we've had this at my end, like, who else does anatomy? Because anatomy as a field, it's not that it doesn't exist anymore, but like, when I was an undergrad at University of Bristol, we had an anatomy department, and then it basically just folded because no one does anatomy degrees anymore. And if the medics aren't teaching anatomy and you don't have classical anatomists, who studies that stuff? And the answer is it's us, because my fellow biologists all do genetics and developmental and da-da-da-da-da, but like, you give them a bone or you give them a muscle and they're like, the hell's this? We don't do that stuff, because we don't, even at an undergrad level. I got the vast majority of my anatomy as a PhD student, and indeed actually mostly beyond. So I think it's that really weird convergence of the way the history of the subject has gone, coupled with what actually works quite well.
Yeah, and I should also mention, it's not just paleontologists, but also biological anthropologists which is a huge field in itself. A lot of them are teaching anatomy in medical institutions, as well as there are some anatomy programs that still do research in human anatomy. It seems a little bit rarer, but they do exist here.
I'm waiting for the fine artist, paleo artist crossover, because fine artists also do anatomy, could probably teach medical students and do dinosaurs at the same time. That would be amazing. With an arts degree in a medical school, that'd be brilliant.
Yes, and that's not unheard of. There are artists who teach anatomy. In fact, there's someone in our department who got her degree in art and taught art for a long time that teaches anatomy here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ali, and thank you so much for answering my questions and stuff everyone else if they had any.
Oh, thank you.
My favourite bit was the explanation of mammalian expression through suckling. I thought that was amazing because that makes so much sense. Because cool? I was thinking whiskers for the things maybe, and then no, suckling. Obviously, that's one thing that all mammals do. That makes sense.
It is disappointing though that not only can they not whistle, but they can't raise an eyebrow. I mean, I want a Roger Moore stegosaur.
Absolutely, yeah.
Roger Moore stegosaur. I wish I could name the episode Roger Moore stegosaur, but it's not going to make any sense.
It would. Someone would listen to it just to get to this line 5 seconds before the end.
And be disappointed. Excellent. Ali, can you please let us know all of your Twitter? You've got a book out soon, I think, or it's out at the moment. Let us know. Plug away now.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I have a book with co-author with Dave Weisample called Dinosaur Feeding Biology, Illustrated Guide to Dinosaur Feeding Biology. It's coming out in America in June, I believe in England maybe a little bit later, a couple months later. I'm really excited about that. On Twitter, you can find me at vert_anatomist, so VERT_anatomist. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for being on. It was really fun. A massive thank you to Ali Nabavizadeh there. That was really cool because I was really worried when you said, Izzy, we're going to get somebody on to talk about Jaws. I was like, but Manabu's already done that, Dave. But that was like, they're different.
Yes.
And exciting. And it's really cool.
But I think it actually does quite a good job. You know, we've effectively had 3 biomechanics because we've had Manabu talking about the Theropods and Ali talking about the ornithischians and John talking about biomechanics of moving animals. And yet their disciplines are, obviously they intersect, they're all doing biomechanics, but, so different. And then even Manabu, he's tackling, a lot of kind of simple jaw modeling because theropods have simple jaws, whereas Ali's having to tackle the muscle arrangements, which aren't irrelevant, but in theropods, but are much more integrated. And then, and this is one of those things I think people can miss with a lot of paleontology in that, and it's true, of course, for a lot of biological sciences as well, but it's almost like everyone's an expert in 2 things. So you say like, oh, he's a dinosaur expert, right? But he does dinosaur behavior. So he's a dinosaur expert and he's a behavior expert. And he's a systematics expert. So he's a dinosaur expert, but he's also a systematics expert. Or he's theropods and systematics, or he's ornithischians and tooth, and you can end up with 2 people. I mean, me and Ali would be quite a good example where they're like, oh, well, they're both dinosaur guys. And it's like, right, but I do theropods and he does ornithischians and I do behavior and he does jaw mechanics. We're kind of looking at different groups in different ways for different reasons using different lines of data. We're pretty separate, actually.
Yeah. And also, I just think, it gives anybody with an art degree hope that you can actually teach anatomy at Johns Hopkins. That's amazing. I think that's wonderful. So, yes, it's the questions episode next week. You might still have time to get your questions in, maybe, but get them in really quickly. Just email us at terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. But I suppose, we've already done the mooing for the hadrosaurs. And I do want to keep their unique jaw thing going because it's literally the only thing they have, Dave, and you tried to ruin it by bringing that in with the Triceratops. Give the hadrosaurs something. There's nothing they've got other than their basic food for theropods.
Headgear. Well, in half of them.
Yeah, exactly.
The boring half don't have one, and now I've offended at least half a dozen hadrosaur researchers.
No, hadrosaurs are lovely and they're important and moo. So, after 3, we're going to do a lovely rar. Traditional, beautiful, say goodbye. So, 1, 2, 3. Thank you for downloading this episode of Terrible Lizards. For extra content, become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. Dave's book, The Future of Dinosaurs, or How Fast Did T-Rex Run, is available to buy now. Do check out Izzy Lawrence's other podcasts and books by visiting iszi.com. Please send questions, suggestions, and other feedback to terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. And catch up with old live episodes on youtube.com/ISZITube. Do leave us a review, it does make a difference, and find us on social media and say hello with the hashtag Terrible Lizards. Thanks again to our patrons. Without your support, we wouldn't be making this series.